a time not so long ago when America's cities hummed with industry and promise, there existed a peculiar slowness that settled over everything, like morning fog. It was the late 1800s, and if you walked down any street in any town, you might notice something odd. Adults moved as if wading through invisible water, their eyes perpetually twinkling with a faraway dreaminess. Children watched, curious but accepting, as their parents, teachers, and neighbors floated through life on a soft, chemical cloud. This is the story of Little Nellie, a sharp-eyed girl who observed the great naptime nation with the unblinking curiosity of someone too young to know what questions should never be asked. Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we're traveling to another world, one built not on legendary stories or ancient myths, but on something far stranger. Recent history. A time when every household had a brown bottle on the shelf, when pharmacies sold opium like candy, and when absolutely nobody thought this was odd. So, settle in. Let your mind drift back to an America that moved like honey, and meet a little girl who watched it all unfold with innocent, wondering eyes. Nellie was 7 years old, with braids the color of wheat and questions that tumbled from her mouth like marbles from a jar. She lived on Maple Street in a modest house where the wallpaper peeled at the corners and her mother's laughter came slow and syrupy, like molasses poured on a winter morning. While other children simply accepted the world as it was presented, adults were mysterious. That was just how things were. Nellie watched with the sharp curiosity of a sparrow. She catalogued the strange behaviors of every grown-up she encountered, building a mental map of their drowsy kingdom. To her, adults were creatures perpetually on the edge of sleep, and she made it her mission to understand why. Every evening, like clockwork that had learned to yawn, Nellie's father would settle into the worn armchair by the fireplace. He'd open a storybook, usually something involving princes or talking animals, and begin to read in a voice like warm molasses dripping from a spoon. But without fail, by the third page, his words would begin to slow. His eyelids would flutter like moths around a lamp, and then, mid-sentence, his head would gently tip forward in peaceful surrender. Nellie learned to finish the stories herself, inventing wild adventures for princesses and dragons that her father would never remember starting. Sometimes she wondered if perhaps this was how all stories were meant to be told, begun by one dreamer and completed by another, like a relay race where nobody ever crossed the finish line. At the Maple Street School, Miss Thornbury would stand before the chalkboard each morning, explaining arithmetic with graceful languid gestures that made numbers seem like they were floating through water. But then, as predictable as sunrise, she would suddenly need just a moment's rest. She would sink into a chair behind the desk, a serene smile spreading across her lips like butter on warm bread, while the children were left entirely to their own devices. Nellie and the other students would quietly slip outside to play elaborate games of make-believe, returning just in time for Miss Thornbury to wake and praise them for being such well-behaved pupils. The lessons Nellie learned during these unsupervised hours: how to climb trees, how to settle disputes with words instead of fists, how to imagine entire worlds from nothing but sunlight and dirt, seemed far more valuable than anything written on the chalkboard. Mr. Donahue, the mailman, was a fixture of the neighborhood, always whistling a tune that seemed to have no beginning or end, just an endless middle that looped back on itself. Nellie noticed early on that he rarely delivered letters to the correct houses, often placing Mrs. Sis's Park. Chen's correspondence in the Johnson's box and vice versa. It was like watching someone play a very slow, very confused game of musical chairs with envelopes. Wherever Mr. Donahue went, he left behind a faint, sweet scent that Nellie thought smelled like her grandmother's rosewater, mixed with something earthier, stranger. She began following him on his route, offering to help with the genuine enthusiasm only a 7-year-old can muster. He would agree with a pleasant nod, but continue his wandering pattern, stopping occasionally to lean against lampposts with his eyes half closed, dreaming in the afternoon sun like a cat who'd found the perfect patch of warmth. On her walks through town, Nellie often paused at the pharmacy window, passing her nose against the glass to study the colorful bottles and mysterious labels arranged like soldiers in neat rows. There were tonics and syrups, elixirs and remedies, each promising relief from ailment she didn't fully understand. Nervousness, sleeplessness, the vapors, modern life itself, whatever that meant. The pharmacist, Mr. Wendell, would stand behind his counter with heavy-lidded eyes, mixing prescriptions with the careful, dreamlike movements of someone underwater. Nellie noticed that nearly every adult in town made weekly visits to collect their brown bottles, clutching them like precious treasures as they drifted back out into the slow-moving streets. The bottles had friendly names: Mrs. Estati Gentoo, Winslow's Soothing Syrup, Godfrey's Cordial, McMunn's Elixir. They promised comfort, calm, and relief from the burden of being fully awake. As summer stretched long and golden, Nellie found herself on the edge of a question she couldn't quite form. She noticed the bottles, the sweet rosewater smell, the perpetual drowsiness, and some instinct told her these things were connected, pieces of a puzzle she was too young to fully assemble. But in the profound wisdom that sometimes visits children, she sensed that some questions were better left unasked, some mysteries better observed than solved. The adults in her life seemed content, perhaps even happy in their gentle fog. They smiled more. They worried less. Time moved differently for them, stretching and folding like taffy, and maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a terrible thing. Who was she? A small girl with wheat-colored braids, to demand they wake from a dream they'd willingly entered. That autumn, as the days grew shorter and the air turned crisp, Nellie began to feel a new sensation creeping over her, a comfortable heaviness in her limbs, a desire to move just a little slower. She found herself understanding the appeal of afternoon rests, of watching dust motes drift through sunbeams, of letting conversations trail off into peaceful silence. On the first truly cold night of fall, as her father began another bedtime story that would inevitably remain unfinished, Nellie felt her own eyelids grow heavy, and for the first time she didn't resist. And so ends the tale of Little Nellie and her drowsy world, where America sailed on a sea of opium-laced calm, and nobody thought to question the tide. It would be decades before anyone realized that perhaps giving everyone, including children, unlimited access to narcotics was, shall we say, not ideal. But for a brief, strange moment in history, the whole nation floated together on that peaceful chemical sea, moving through life like honey poured from a jar. So tonight, as you drift off, remember that the world has always been a little strange, a little absurd, and that sometimes the most shocking thing about history is how recently it happened. Close your eyes. Let yourself float on that same peaceful current, and know that all the sharp edges can wait until morning. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.